do not forget that Europe is a very fragile entity constructed out of treaties. Right? It's not meant to be in the open without protection in a dog-eat-dog world. Well, I think the great philosopher Mike Tyson said, we all have a plan until someone punches you in the face, right? And I think that's what's happening to Germany and Europe right now.
There's a law in thermodynamics, it's called entropy. And it says that the entropy of a system basically only increases with time. And entropy here means disorderliness, randomness, uncertainty. Are we not living in an age of strategic entropy?
So China has this very concrete fear that in the case of a conflict, the US could cut off its supply lines, especially in the Strait of Malacca, which is, I think, around Singapore, only 18 kilometers wide. Right? Well, I mean, there's a little fact that's quite interesting that gets us into the right direction. The very same day that Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, the German government collapsed. Within 24 hours. And I think that is precisely on the money.
So while Europeans' efforts in rearming will be focusing on the European theater, it cannot, or in a very limited capacity, be an actor in the Indo-Pacific. We cannot project power in the realm of security.
समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं?
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया.
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉप अप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
आप समझा.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Today's geopolitics is under no obligation to make sense to us. At least that is what we realize in the current interregnum between the old order, which is fraying at its edges, and a new one whose contours are still not clear. Now, an interregnum that is marred by various polycrises, one after the other and also at the same time. A product of forced cross-pollination of deglobalization and remilitarization, where structural and systemic forces are pushing us to transform. The role of America under Donald Trump is more baffling than ever. China is fueling instability across different theaters and in India's neighborhood. And the world has not only seen the return of conventional wars that were started to last about 5 days and now stretching on to years with no end in sight. In the middle of all this, politics among nations and blocs has taken many a twists and turns, creating newer forms of realignment, hedging, cooperation and competition, all in brute self-interest as multilateralism and the liberal order that fueled it is failing. So, how is the grand realignment between great powers playing out, and what is the role of the middle order powers in it? And finally, what is the future of the world we live in? To unpack the polycrises of our times and the worrying strategic entropy we live in, I have on the Worldview with Swasti today two distinguished experts who have a lot of discerning and experience of studying and researching various parts of the world with a solid analytical grounding both in their home theatres and in India. I'm very pleased to welcome Marc Saxer, a political analyst, strategist and author. After spending more than a decade in Asia, he currently serves as the head of the regional office of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, or the FES, a German political foundation operating in the Asia Pacific. His work, especially his brilliant book on the state of geopolitics, Transformative Realism, has been published in more than 20 languages. He is a widely published author with a keen eye on our geopolitical times. The second guest for the day is Christoph Mohr, who currently serves as the FES country director and resident representative to India. Christoph is a trained political scientist and an international relations expert. He has specialized in the Indian subcontinent with a base in Delhi for the last few years, where he currently lives. Now, prior to this engagement, he was the FES regional director to Central Asian countries and also for Africa. I welcome both of them to Worldview with Swasti today. Let's start. Good morning to you. And tell me, Marc, what brings you to Delhi?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I used to be based in Delhi and I always come back. So it's a little bit of a homecoming for me. But also, I say, I'm based in Bangkok, but I live in an airplane. So I'm very, very interested to go around the region. And that really means from Afghanistan to Japan, all the way down to Australia. To talk to people about what they see when they look at the geopolitical competition and geoeconomic disruptions in the region. So I'm meeting a lot of people, already met a lot of people here in Delhi. It's very, very interesting to me, and I'm always happy to come back.
Well, I know Delhi is like second home to you, and you know India very well. And Christoph, you're based in Delhi, right?
Right.
So you just before we dive deeper into the more serious issues about what really ails our world and continues to ail our world, tell me a little bit about what is your role here, what is FES doing, what does FES stand for?
Right. So FES is a political foundation, Friedrich Ebert Foundation. We're linked to the Social Democratic Party of Germany. We just turned 100 years, not in India, but globally. In our headquarters in Berlin. In India, we work for about 40 years now. Having Marc over is always fun on a personal level, picking his brain on many, many issues. But on a more serious note, what we're trying to do here is we try to build a bridge between India and Germany. And one topic, of course, and Marc already touched upon it, is geopolitics, geoeconomics of the region, but also India's foreign policy and position vis-a-vis many global trends. And decoding that, learning about these things, and bringing this also to our home audience in Germany. It's one part of our mission here, and doing this together with FES Asia, headed by Marc out of Bangkok, but also with the colleagues from CSDR, but also with the colleagues from Lee Kuan Yew School is quite fun also. And yeah, I can't wait for the exercise on Monday to start.
Yeah, so what Christoph here is referring to are different kind of scenario buildings that FES does actually very well. I myself have been a part of that, and we're basically trying to then assess how the global risks are and what really should be the coordinated responses. But coming back to global risks, Marc, one thing, if I may be allowed to give this particular metaphor, is that it seems, there's a law in thermodynamics. It's called entropy. And it says that the entropy of a system basically only increases with time. And entropy here means disorderliness, randomness, uncertainty. Are we not living in an age of strategic entropy? Look at the cost of COVID-19 pandemic. One would have imagined that we would emerge from it wiser. But as we were emerging, we had a Russia-Ukraine war. Trillions of dollars worth of cost. Trillions of dollars of, again gone down the drain with what happened in the Red Sea. And then we are in the middle of assessing an impending crisis in Taiwan. And then Donald Trump comes with his Liberation Day tariffs. Where are we going?
Well, I think I agree. We definitely live in what I call like a time of uncertainty. Historically speaking, is quite normal. Great powers rise and then they decline. They build orders and then orders erode and collapse. And sooner or later being replaced with a new order. And now we are seeing the end of American hegemony. We're seeing the end of what we call the unipolar moment, when the US reigned supreme after winning the Cold War. We're seeing the end of the liberal world order, and we're in the middle of a struggle over what comes next, right? And that takes a lot of certainty away. To be honest, if I talk to industry leaders, if I talk to political decision makers, if I talk to civil society activists, we have to do very long-reaching decisions that can, affect our lives for decades to come. But if we're really honest, Swasti, we don't exactly know how next year is going to look like. So that creates a strategic sense of uncertainty that makes a lot of people nervous. And I think it creates an anxiety that we feel in the time that we live in. And I think this is the time for this kind of future forecasting exercises that helps us to make a little bit of sense of what's happening around us.
Well, that's a good primer, because even in my own assessments, we all tend to sort of agree to this one thing, that we are definitely living in a transformational moment. Now, what comes out of it, the contours perhaps are just emerging. We're not very certain about how the next order is going to look like, but for sure the older order is not going to help. But Christoph, help me understand this a little bit better, because while on the one hand we see transformation really, and this transformation, I think you'll agree, is quite structural. So there are structural structural forces that are pushing for this transformation. But at the same time, you see a lot of, I would say, preference for status quoism. And I ask you this question because you're here in India, and India is a status quoist power. We would like the order to remain the way it is to try and reduce the uncertainty. I mean, do you think my reading is correct, and what's your assessment of that?
Look, I come from Germany, and one could argue that we're also a power that, likes the status quo to a degree, right? We've been quite comfortable in status quo. I mean, if you think about it, the liberal world order, economic globalization, multilateral trade, that was working well for our country for many, many years and is the backbone of our economic power and wealth, right? And as Marc rightly pointed out, all of that is under question. All of it is under threat. Some of it is already gone. And naturally, these changes that are to occur or already have occurred, they bring uncertainty. They bring uncertainty to the political economy, to the population, to many, many people asking, what is next? I think what's different fundamentally is that, look, we live in times of social media, information is everywhere, it's prevalent. It comes from all sides, and it brings uncertainty also to, the families, to the people out there not understanding exactly what comes next. And honestly, I think even on a strategic assessment level, even the analysts and the strategists just don't know. And that underlying uncertainty, how does the next order look like? How do we go for the next 3 weeks even? That is tricky for all countries, and countries have to navigate it to a certain degree. I think, look, India from a distance has been navigating it quite successfully. You guys had a very good relationship with the last US administration, but you also have a very good relationship with Trump. You managed in Trump 1.1 to have that bilateral relationship and to craft it in a way that it served your political economy well. So while you say that India is a status quo country, and I think you're reflecting on the multilateralism that also serves you well and will serve you well, but it is also a country that is adapting, that's pragmatic, that's transactional here and there. And I think that functions quite well in the current system.
Well, it was interesting the way you put it, because I think one of the things about Germany is that I think everybody can see that Germany has been most resistant to the existential crises that sort of has befallen your continent. And from India's perspective, we would like to learn from conflicts and wars and other theaters, and not wait for something to happen in our own backyard for us to change. So I'm very much with you on that. But before I get into how to develop a more coordinated, coherent response, say for example, to all the transformative changes in the world, let's first spend some time on what really are those risks that we keep talking about. I did start with some risks about COVID and then wars, etc. But then in near term and in the long term, Marc, would you like to sort of list a few?
Well, maybe we look at it because we're both from Europe, from a European perspective, and then very happy to go into a perspective maybe closer to home for you. If you look at the 3 pillars of order in Europe, and Europe has been a complicated continent. I always say, like, we had 1,500 years of war against each other, and now we're at 80 years of peace. So I think from a human level, it's very understandable there's a certain nostalgia and a certain adherence to the order that has now collapsed. But it is collapsing, and there's basically 3 pillars. Number one, there's of course a security pillar that had 2 elements. Number one, it was a security guarantee by the United States, who also acted as an offshore balancer, which is, I think, enormously important. So this equation that Europe by itself could not solve for more than a millennia, the US had solved for a few decades. You're going to see that a lot of the internal squabbling, but also a competition between the smaller and bigger European powers will re-emerge if the US really retreats, right? So the same people that are now begging Germany to rearm going to be afraid of Germany in 10 years from now when this has happened, right? These elements have been suspended for a while, they will reemerge. So that's one part of the security order. The other part of the security order was the Charter of Paris. So we tried to codify a security order where we basically say borders are sacrosanct, they could not be shifted unilaterally, certainly not by violence. and that has been upended basically by the war in Ukraine. So that means that the security order has collapsed at the same time, and that affects India just the same way as it does Germany. The second that the liberal hegemon, the United States, declares the liberal world order for obsolete, right? That also means that the economic order is shifting as we speak right now. We're seeing the tariff war. So that means this whole idea that there's an open movement, an open global market, free movement of goods and services, free movement of capital, free movement of people is being declared over not by some power, but by the guarantor of this order. And I think we have to take that very seriously. So that means there's lots and lots of disruptions in the supply chains, in the trade order, in the currency order, in the tech order, and all of that. And that is an enormous problem for a world market going, export-led, interdependence embracing economy like Germany and large parts of Europe. And third, the third pillar is the social contract at home. So number one, you have enormous costs. We're talking about 4% GDP that you will have to invest, number one, in order to recreate the capabilities for territorial defense and deterrence, but also we have a crumbling infrastructure that needs to be repaired. And also, I think the innovativeness of industry doesn't look so good, like we're falling behind, let's say, China and others. So you're going to have to invest a lot of money. That's a good thing, but someone has to also pay that. Right? And who's that going to be? Are you going to cut social transfers to a lower third of the population? Are you going to tax the wage earners in the middle of the population? Or are you going to actually tax the wealthy at the top? None of these solutions is covered by the social contract. So that means we have upended the social contract. We're going into enormous distributional conflicts within the society. And that creates the populist moment that you see in the West. The populist moment for me has three elements. Number one, I think people understand on a very fundamental level that things cannot stay the way they are, that they're probably going to get worse. Number two, they have a very distinct feeling that they're not being told the entire truth about the challenges, either because they're openly lied to or because they have an inkling that the elites themselves do not understand what's going on. And number three, and you think about what happened after 2008, the financial crisis, also quite legitimate. They have a strong fear that they're going to be the ones who actually have to pick up the cost. And not only in terms of money, but also in terms of the lives of their sons and daughters in some trenches. So that creates enormous anxiety and actually also rage within the society. And you're going to find some political entrepreneur who takes advantage of that. But my point is that all of this is caused and is rooted in the collapse of liberal hegemony. And now we're seeing that all the pillars, that the heavens have collapsed on us, so to say. All the pillars that actually security, economy, social contract at the same time are crumbling. So that's a perfect storm.
Is there a silver lining?
Well, of course, there's a silver lining. Every crisis is an opportunity. I think if we're being honest with ourselves, this situation has been there for a long time. Like I said, there is a certain nostalgia that I understand because I am German. The last order was good for us. We were living in peace. We were living in prosperity. And of course, you want to have one more year, one more year, one more year. And I think some of the policymakers, including the famous Angela Merkel, were capitalizing on this feeling that just leave us alone a little bit longer. We know it's not going to last, but a little bit longer.
Yeah.
But what it meant is that you were adhering to something that no longer exists. And you were lost a decade or two where some of the adaptations that now have to come brutally fast could have been done faster in the last decade or the decade before. So Germany is behind the curve because we were just had the illusion that we are like the island of the blessed in a sea of chaos. And now, when I'm here in South Asia, I always like the charm of my counterparts. People are telling me, welcome to the rest of us.
Well, of course, Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are world's problems and world's problems are not Europe's problem. I think it's a statement now too famous to require any footnoting. But coming back, I do agree, and the way we describe it is that Europe's holiday from history is over. But it does intrigue me for a while, and I know we are talking about competitiveness here, and Germany is behind the curve, you mentioned. Christoph, recently Mario Draghi came up with a very comprehensive report on what really does Europe need to do. And one of the things was this systemic, I would say, ignorance or maybe avoidance of trying to invest in competitiveness. And that is what you're bearing the consequences of. Why do you think Germany was not really, it's the biggest economy of Europe? It's the engine of European Union in so many ways. Why do you think there was this disdain, this ignorance? I mean, everybody can be a genius in hindsight, but it does intrigue us. Why did you not take the right decisions at the right time?
Look, I see the criticism, and I think looking back ex post ante on something, it's always easy analytically and say, why did you not, for example, invest in infrastructure? Calculation just for Germany alone, just for infrastructure alone, is about 600 billion euros in money that hasn't been invested in the past, but should have been invested. Our bridges are falling, our trains are not on time. So there is obviously something, if you look in retrospect, that should have been done years and decades ago. But I think Marc has a very valid point, right? Germany, to a degree, pretended a bit to be an island where status quo very much functioned well for our society. I mean, we're still the third largest economy on the planet, right? It worked well till it doesn't, right? And what happened was an external shock that set it all off. And if you look at the traffic light coalition, 3 years, almost 4 years in power, they essentially couldn't settle on how to get out of it. Essentially it boiled down to the question of the debt brake, if we should take on additional debt to buy ourselves out of this situation. But essentially it was a country still discussing on how to come out of it. And that essentially explains to you what Marc described. We're a country that is behind the curve, that needs to catch up on the conversation. And politics is always a two-level game, right? So your foreign policy understanding is a function of also your domestic dynamics, right?
Absolutely.
And the populist backlash is real, it's substantial, it's huge. And if it's not covered under the social contract, this creative destruction, Schumpeter, right? It needs to come out with a solution quickly. I think politics is also about performance and finding output quickly. People have grievances. They don't feel they're equally addressed, and they feel it's coming from all sides at the same time, right? And I think this coalition that is now, coming in very soon, they have an incredibly long list of to-dos and grievances to address and decisions to make, and a lot of money is now put into the system. But I'm also seeing a silver lining there. Many of the messages that haven't been received maybe a couple of years ago, they're now very much discussed in Berlin. So I try to be a realist to a degree, and also see, look, yes, we're not in the best position and not in the best shape, but there's plenty of room to maneuver. But it needs to be done very, very soon.
All right. So the sense that I get from, of course, to my question is that, yes, there is silver lining. But let's just spend a little bit of time, because this is something which is not really understood here in India, at least, which is this entire puzzle of the debt brake. And I ask you this question because even with the traffic light coalition, which was, now outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz's coalition, I think it failed in many ways because it was not really meant to handle a war-like situation. I mean, that's my reading. You please correct me if I'm wrong. And one of the things was that they did try, and there is a fancy word that has become very famous all over the world, which is about Zeitenwende. They did try for the Zeitenwende, a structural transformation, a shift to happen, but probably the debt brake got in there, it blocked it. And now with Friedrich Merz, he has been speaking about sort of, relaxing the debt brake. Where do you think, how should we make sense of what is happening there now?
Well, I mean, there's a little fact that's quite interesting that gets us into the right direction. The very same day that Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, the German government collapsed within 24 hours. And I think that is precisely on the money. And just to give you some numbers, how ironic all of this is. That the government collapsed over a sum of 8 billion euros, which is not that much within the German budget. And now, 2 months later, we're having coalition negotiations to form a new government. It's already decided that we're going to spend 800 billion out of debt. So basically, the last Minister of Finance, a liberal, let fail a government within one of the biggest crises Germany has seen since World War II, over a minuscule sum. Only that a few weeks later, we actually open up that corset that has been holding Germany back for a decade or two. All this underinvestment, not only in defense, but also in infrastructure and innovation, etc., has been caused by this underinvestment, right? So that needed to be corrected, and everybody knew about it, and there's a lot of political dancing around this, etc. But the question that you're rightfully asking is why is that thing there in the first place? And it has very much to do with what I said earlier. There was a thing called liberal hegemony for decades, right? In Germany, it was a little bit different. It wasn't neoliberal, it was order-liberal. And this idea, austerity, balanced books, be fiscally prudent or very conservative, was absolutely hegemonic. The incoming chancellor was also a great proponent of this. And now, because of the pressure of the factual, right, the sheer reality of the situation, these kind of delusions have to go.
If I may build on it a bit.
Of course,
Look, I think that fiscal conservatism was hegemonic in the discourse. That's true. But it also didn't need to be addressed when the last coalition, traffic light coalition, was building that coalition, right? The agreement, Germans love agreements and documents, and it all needs to be signed. And there's a reason for it. But when the three parties, it was the first time our country ever had a three-party coalition, right? Very different parties, ranging from the Greens to the Liberals and with the Social Democrats in the center. They didn't need to settle their different opinions on that fiscal conservatism, meaning the debt brake. Why? Because it was a very different time back then, right? The world has changed dramatically in the last 3-4 years, right? So the circumstances were different that didn't need to be addressed at that point. So what they did is they took a list of long issues they wanted to address. They gave themselves the title of the Future Coalition. That was attractive to many, many people. It was to bring about change after 16 years of Angela Merkel's status quo alliance. And look, then the Ukraine war happened and the whole coalition agreement essentially was obsolete. And then they were winging it for the rest of that period. And look, it's not all wrong. They also had notable accomplishments. That's all there. But the external shock and the external challenges as the system is changing, they were decisive. And I think that in the end boiled down to that very question on how to address it. Do we do it within our budget, fiscally conservative, because that somehow served us well, or it didn't? Or is it the opposing opinion and say, no, you need to have more money in the system? Ultimately, that question has been answered, but just after the election.
Right. But talking about the traffic light coalition, and from India's perspective, there were 3 or 4 changes. Of course, I mentioned the Zeitenwende, and I think you're the right person to answer whether it worked or not. We all here, of course, know that it didn't work the way it should, and that's what we are alluding to here. But there were a couple of or more documents that the previous government came up with, which was of a lot of interest to us here. One was Germany's first ever strategy on China, and the de-risking discourse. And I am going to pick your brains on that, followed by their national security strategy, again, which was put together by the Traffic Light Coalition. And building on these two, then we have an India in Focus document. So from China to the continent, to Indo-Pacific, and the Ukraine war. I mean, it just looks too much of preoccupation at the same time. So of course, you're going to be telling me about whether this will work or not, but please first tell me, where are those documents going? What are the objectives met? What is happening in Germany about them?
Well, I think the great philosopher Mike Tyson said, "We all have a plan until someone punches you in the face," right? and I think that's what's happening to Germany and Europe right now. Is like there's been a series of crises hitting us. You know, the financial crisis, euro crisis, climate crisis, migration crisis, Ukraine, Gaza, you name it. Right? It's just been being hammered, and I think, you know, if we just look at that very, very short amount of time in 3 years, Germany and Europe had so many 180 degrees flips when it comes to policy, when it comes to defense, when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to energy policy, when it comes to nuclear policy, when it comes to migration policy, fiscal policy we just talked about. So I think on the policy level, I think a lot of the adaptations are already happening. What you're referring to, and that is also one of my frustrations, is that on the strategic level, I think mentally a lot of Europeans, especially Germans, have not yet arrived in this new world that is going to happen, right? So we did have a unipolar world, we did have a couple of rules of the games that was a good thing for Europe. Do not forget that Europe is a very fragile entity constructed out of treaties, right? It's not meant to be in the open without protection in a dog-eat-dog world, right? So we're very invested in a rule-based order, and we're very happy in the liberal world order. And I do understand that's not the case for other parts of the world, but that was basically how we looked at the world. So there is a certain, you know, affection and attachment to this old thinking. And if you read some of the documents that are coming out right now out of Germany, we're still talking about systemic rivalry between democracy and autocracy and all that nonsense. That is basically language from the liberal order, which was been declared obsolete. What is happening, Swasti, we're going back to something that Europeans actually should know. We're going into a world of a concert of powers, right? There's certainly two of them, as you know, I mean, United States and China. Russia is making a bid right now to be number 3. I think that is actually what is driving all of the Ukraine war, as well as the negotiations with the US. And if India and the European Union make it to be in the P5, so to say, I think, you know, is one of the open questions of history, right? But it would look very, very similar to what Europe had in the 19th century, a concert of powers of constant hedging and balancing, seeking some sort of stability and equilibrium. And that's the new kind of thinking. And it takes Europe quite a bit of you know, effort to arrive in this world that it itself built 100 years ago. And what you were referring to, the China strategy and all of the Indo-Pacific strategies, is still very much coupled with US, or like, let's say, the Biden administration attempt to retain American primacy, right? So the Biden administration basically told Europe, look, guys, we're going to contain China, and there's 2 options. Either you do it with us in the Indo-Pacific, and if you can't do that, you don't want to do that, we're going to shift the burden in Europe onto your shoulders. And what the Trump administration has now done, and it was not only Biden, it was Obama, there would have been Harris. It's been being told to Europe for a very long time. So basically, Trump has now called the shots. They say, okay, you're not coming to the Indo-Pacific, you're not decoupling from China, then we call the shots, and that means the burden of European defense is now on you, right? And I think that is, you know, that is now a given. But that if you flip that, it means that a lot of that language, a lot of that thinking, you know, of de-risking from China, you already see it. I mean, if you look at what Japan and South Korea are doing, but you also look at what the German industry has been already doing in that last 1 or 2 weeks, is, of course, if you're under enormous pressure from Russia and the US at the same time, you play the India and you play the China card.
Well, I'm happy that you mentioned something very important, that return of concert of Europe, you know, those times, because unless we know where we're coming from, I think we don't know where we're going. It applies as much to Europe, to India, to any other part of the world. So was that also what Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, had in mind when he gave a very provocative statement that Europe must die? Christoph?
I don't know, but he might, right? He probably was thinking about the old Europe, right? He probably understands that Europe in this dog-eat-dog world needs a decisive change, right? I think, look, Marc described it well. If you just bring it back to my own country, I think it's no surprise that the language in some of the documents you were referring to is still of the so-called old world, because again, that old world served us so very well, didn't it? Right? So it's hard to let go. So we're playing catch up strategically here, but some of the documents you mentioned, the India in Focus paper from the Foreign Office.
Yes.
I think this is, again, it's not on a strategic level; it's rather on a policy level. But then again, I think if you club it together with some of the documents coming out of the coalition talks as some sort of first glance into the new administration, I think what's there and what's visible is while Germany might not be fully there strategically in the understanding of the upcoming multipolar world and how to navigate it, I think on a policy level, some takeaways are also reflecting this already. And I think, look, in the first papers coming out of the coalition talk, it refers to some countries, one being India, as strategic partners, and it acknowledges that the strategic partnership that we're having for, 25 years now, that it needs to be put on a higher level, that it needs to be, invested more. So strategically, the document reflects the India in Focus paper by saying we identify India and other countries as strategic partners in the upcoming multipolar world. That last sentence is probably not there yet, but I try to be, again, an optimist, and I see and I want to read it in these papers already.
Yeah, so talking about India in Focus, I think one of the things that decisively changed, see, India and Germany are natural partners. We have the history and the association goes a long way back. But talking strategically, one of the things that changed for the better during the traffic light coalition was Boris Pistorius, who was Germany's Minister of Defense, approach towards India. So from India's perspective, just as we were trying to sort of become more embedded in the global supply chains for defense equipment, etc., trying to diversify our defense dependence on Russia, etc., you have this change in Germany that we saw for sure under Boris Pistorius, that focusing on India is in Germany's interest, and also from a time when Germany was reluctant to give us even the small arms, to now when it's with Germany that we have the biggest strategic partnership model for the submarines, right? That has come a long way.
But that's exactly what I was referring to. That's the realism that is creeping in already and has been creeping in already. Germany does very much understand the importance of the bilateral relationship with India and all its shapes and sizes and forms, right? Like we know what sectors to invest in and what are the future sectors of our bilateral cooperation, one being defense and all of that. And I think the minister has understood that quite well for a long time. Therefore, he acted on it. Again, I think there is plenty of room to build on it. And I think the new coalition does reflect that already in the first wording coming out.
Right. Now, just because we are mentioning about security, let me just circle back to Indo-Pacific a little bit. And, Marc, I was speaking to another expert on Indo-Pacific and, whatever's happening under Trump now. And I think he did not mince his words and say that the question on Taiwan, China's blockade or invasion or whatever you may want to call it, we'll have to see. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Right. First, do you agree with it? And two, what do you think are we doing for that kind of a worst case scenario?
I do not agree with it. And I give you a reason for that. But first of all, let us understand why Taiwan is such a central question. And I think that's obviously understood. So if you look at the geopolitical map of the Indo-Pacific from the perspective of Beijing and from the perspective of Washington, you look at that's the same thing, but you see something completely different, right? What China sees is that it's basically encircled by the US and its allies, and in a very fundamental and concrete sense by these so-called island chains, which is a chain of military installations that reach from Japan all the way down basically to the Strait of Malacca and so on. So China has this very concrete fear that in the case of a conflict, the US could cut off its supply lines, especially in the Strait of Malacca, which is, I think, around Singapore, only 18 kilometers wide, right? So you could interpret everything China has been doing in the last 10 years as an attempt to break out of this perceived encirclement. Westwards, that's the BRI, that is supposed to gain access to the energy supplies of the Middle East as well as the European market. And it has very important sidearms. One of them runs to Pakistan, the other one runs to Myanmar. This is actually where most of the construction is being done, and they're both meant to circumvent the Strait of Malacca. Eastward, first of all, they want to push out potential adversaries out of the South China Sea by militarizing it, and then break through the island chains into the strategic depth of the Pacific, or the island hopping that we're reading right now. That's part of that. So China perceives that as a defensive move. And classical security dilemma, if you flip the script and you look at it from the perspective of Washington and its allies, this is aggressive behavior, right? And what they see is the first military peer since Pearl Harbor that is pushing into the Pacific. And that puts Taiwan right bang in the middle, where these two tectonic plates, so to say, collide. And I think if we're talking about 2023, when we had this, what I call Taiwan fever in Washington, right? I think this is where all these numbers come from, 2027 or something, an attack is imminent, and Nancy Pelosi went to the island, etc. I think what happened since is number one, during the Biden administration, both sides have been running war games. And I think they've been quite sobering for both sides. Basically, they don't believe they can win it, not conventionally, and they also could not rule out a nuclear escalation, which is obviously something you shouldn't want in the first place. I think the Trump administration has yet to show its cards. That is, I think, probably one of the follow-up questions, how the US and China are going to, handle their bilateral relationship. We're going to dive into that. But if we stick to the Taiwan situation, I think the stakes are so enormously high that if you look at the geopolitical map of the world, there is three main or primary theaters of contestation. Europe is hot. The Middle East is hot. But East Asia is not. And that, I think, has to do with the fact that the stakes are so high. And I think the Biden administration in the last year or last 2 years in San Francisco, I think, has basically opted for strategic management of competition with China, played out mostly geoeconomically on the fields of economics and tech. The Trump administration, like I said, still has to show its cards. But so far, there's a lot of sound that sounds geoeconomic. Right? We don't hear military sounds yet. But I think this is an open question. But I think this idea that there is like a timeline ticking, I think it's way more complicated than that.
Right.
One thing
Christoph,
to
you
add,
want to add to it?
just very briefly. I think Marc specifically spoke about the security dimension of it. And I think if you look from a European or German perspective, and you mentioned the Indo-Pacific strategy, right? As of now, Marc also said it, the European theater is hot. And that's, of course, with burden shifting, that's the prime focus of Europe. And obviously so, right? So while Europeans' efforts in rearming will be focusing on the European theater, it cannot, or in a very limited capacity, be an actor in the Indo-Pacific. We cannot project power in the realm of security, right? If we talk about geoeconomics and how that looks like, it might be different. But from a sheer security perspective, Europe and Germany are very limited in their engagement with the Indo-Pacific.
Right. Now, let me just build on the Indo-Pacific dynamic a little bit. And then, since you mentioned, help me understand a little bit how you perceive this great power realignment, between US and China. Of course, you already mentioned that Trump administration has still to sort of show all its cards. But this, and then how are the others, middle orders, for example, India or Europe, would be hedging, in that sense? And I ask you this question specifically, Marc, about not just the obvious answers that everybody knows, but also about how does that impact the gray zone tensions in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I mean, interestingly, the U.S. Has been the Trump administration has been starting its strategic moves much closer to home. They started, interestingly, with Canada and Mexico, right? And the next theater is Russia and Ukraine, and is going to be the Middle East with regards to Iran. And I think it's quite interesting to ponder a little bit. And obviously, I'm not privy to that information, but just to speculate a little bit, what my understanding is, what the US and Russia are actually discussing. There's certain levels, and there's like a very tactical, immediate level, which is about the cessation of hostilities within Ukraine. So that would be a ceasefire or a ceasing of the conflict. It's a very immediate, let's say, narrow kind of understanding, which is still enormously difficult. Because, and I think that's the point I'm trying to make, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So there is dimension that go beyond that. And the next dimension would be if there would be more than just a tactical agreement, but a more or less stable peace solution, which means that we have a new European security order.
Right.
And the price for that from the Russian side would be a sphere of influence. So what the Russians want is not only a buffer zone in Ukraine, but also probably in the Caucasus. My understanding is that is not at all agreed yet, right? And beyond that, on the global level, on the strategic level, is that what we call Kissinger in reverse. So the idea that the Americans and the Russians come to a conclusion that Russia is basically switching camps and switches to the side of the US in the hegemonic struggle with China. So what's so interesting about that, Swasti, is that if we think about these possibilities, the future spectrum goes up very widely.
Yes.
And depending on what happens there, we're in a completely different world. And that, again, will influence very much the strategic calculus of every other power on the planet, as well as bilateral the US and China. So are we really like going into a constellation where you have that tacit agreement? Okay, we call it unlimited partnership between Russia and China, which is not so unlimited as we all know, but also like a triangular relationship, which includes Iran. Or is this thing breaking up? It's entirely unclear. Right?
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because there is an approach, or maybe say a kind of a binary approach when we are trying to understand Russia and China. Okay, one is that Russia-China alliance is more of a marriage of convenience to undermine the Western-led order, etc. And this is perhaps kind of heightened because of the war in Ukraine. And once things go back to normal, reverse Kissinger or reverse Nixon will work, and everything was going to be the way it used to be, that Russia is going to be pulled back into the Western theater, maybe become a part of the G8 again, etc. And the other approach is that the forces that are pushing Russia with China are more systemic. And in fact, what you see in the world today is the emergence of what is often referred to as the CRINC axis, or the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea axis, which are sort of, driving instability in various theaters all at once. And I ask you this question, if you agree with, the systemic factors between Russia and China, and then maybe a follow-up question for you, Christoph, in terms of what space does it leave for other middle order powers? And here, of course, I mean India and Europe.
Well, I mean, marriages of convenience seem to be a very modern thing if we agree that we're going into a more concert of powers like world, right? I think we're going to see less like solid military alliances based on treaties and institutions, and we're going to see much more fluctuating kind of marriages of convenience, minilaterals, sometimes also sectoral specific cooperations, multi-alignment strategies in the world to come. And in that sense, I think that actually fits the time quite well. I think the CRINC axis is united mostly in the rejection of basically the US hegemony and all the, let's say, designs that are attached to that. I'm not so convinced that they have a positive vision that they share. I think if we just look at, let's say, Russia and China and leave the others to the side for a second, I think their outlook on what they want to achieve is a little different, and I think there are different trajectories where they want to go. I think China is at the end of the day more invested in the multilateral system as it was, with all sorts of reforms and adjustments, obviously, right? But it has been working beautifully for China. I mean, this amazing, mind-boggling rise of China wouldn't have been possible without open markets, with some sort of stability, with some sort of rules of the game, right? So China is actually quite invested in that. It's a P5 power. It has a much more benign outlook on the United Nations. And I think Russia is way more resentful against all of these things because it feels it has been taken advantage of after the end of the Cold War. So I think there are differences more on the outlook forward, but I think they come together on this rejection of a US-led world order.
Look, I think India navigated the multipolar world before the multipolar world was even unfolding. If you look back at the last, say, 10 years of Indian foreign policy, I think what stands out from a foreigner's perspective that is also living here in India for 2 years now is that India shifted from the non-aligned to the multi-aligned, became very pragmatic, understood the shortcomings of the multilateral system, moved into bilateral, trilateral, minilateral formats, acted very pragmatically, but also very smart in a way where in which it dealt with the US, for example. I think there is a careful pivot towards the West, especially when it comes to economic cooperation. The West was often read as the US, but it also opens up a strategic convergence with Europe. And I think that is the talk of the town. I think we have seen echoes from the European side also. Von der Leyen basically brought everybody from Brussels to Delhi, and I think
21 commissioners, the entire college was here.
And I think there is a lot of European engagement vis-a-vis Delhi, especially also from the German side. So I think that strategic convergence I'm referring to is understood. And just look at, let's say, the economies, right? India is the 5th largest economy on the planet. GDP per capita is 2,700 euros. India needs to grow to become one global major power, right? I mean, we touched upon 3 major powers: Russia, China, and the US. I think if you look at the middle powers, India and Europe being one, what it takes to, become a great power is, for India, it's growth. It needs to develop further. I think partners in the West will help with that. It's about investment, about free trade. It's about technology transfer, and many, many more things. And what does Europe need? First of all, we have internal challenges. I think we touched upon on a few of those. But we also need new partners. And I think India is destined to become, and is already, one of these major partners. And I think that strategic alignment is there, and it just needs to be built up on and more invested on. And I think that language is there, the commitment is there. I read a lot of political will on both sides, and I think that will help both geographies to eventually become a major power in the multipolar world that is unfolding.
No, I totally agree with you. One of the things that from India's perspective, when I study how our engagement has unfolded for many, many years, and for strategic reasons, I mean, we don't have the time to get into them, but for strategic reasons, Europe has never really caught on India's strategic imagination. But because the nature of security is changing the way it has in the last 3-4 years, I think that is now a talk of the past. Right. And now you see much more convergence, many more pathways of convergence, that are bringing the two sides together, which I think, in my opinion, is going to be a stabilizing force in the world. Because I think India is probably the only, global power or in the making whose rise has not been destabilizing. And I think that brings a lot of, I would say, value to the global order, and especially at a time when there's so much uncertainty. But Marc, let me just pick your brains on this wonderful book that you've written, which is called Transformative Realism. And I think I would urge, it's also, you can find the details in the description box. But Marc calls it his Corona baby, and this book came out in 2022. A lot of things I think were very prophetic in the book about how there is a withering away of the old world order, and what really got me impressed was how you could actually foresee in many ways, so in that sense it has a lot of predictive value about how the old order is no longer going to suffice, and we have to go on to creating new pillars of engagement, etc. If you were to write this book in 2025, I hope you do, but that if you were to do it, what exactly are you going to change here?
Well, I mean, basically, transformative realism for me is a lot about the theory of change. So it has a couple of audiences domestically. I think the key message here is that all strategic thinking needs to start with a very sober assessment of the balance of power. The balance of forces domestically within the different social constituencies and groups and actors, right? But also globally, the conversation we just had when it comes to different powers, right? First, you have to understand what the lay of the land is, what the landscape is, what the balance of power is, and then you develop your strategies from there. That sometimes rubs people the wrong way, because a lot of people like to deduct what needs to happen from greater principles. Let's say take something where I think the three of us completely agree, is that we need to do something to mitigate climate change. Right? So the argument is to say, number one, this is what science tells us, and number two is this is also the more right thing to do. And I agree with that, but we also have to acknowledge that the kind of changes that are actually needed to climate change haven't happened. And I think that has a lot to do with this kind of narrow-sightedness or sometimes blindedness for the balance of power within a society. Just an example, you can take any policy field that you want, right? So what I really urge strategic thinkers or maybe also civil society activists to understand is that you have to have a clearer understanding about the balance of power. And if you then realize that your own resources, your own power resources are quite limited, the only way to go about is to form strategic alliances. So alliance building is the core of everything in order to make change. I wrote this thing in 2021 during the first COVID lockdown, and it's when we look at foreign policy now, where obviously the biggest changes has happened. Obviously, that was before the war in Ukraine, before all of these things happened. So I just talked about that was basically towards the domestic audience, that you have to understand the balance of power. If we just have the same conversation what we just had about the international realm, I think what we described earlier, I think the mentality, especially in Europe, is still very much invested into a liberal world order. So a liberal world order is basically downstream from a constellation of power, of unipolarity, where you have this overwhelming power of the US at the top, which is almost like an empire, right? You have an order-making power at the top that actually creates rules, sanctions rule breakers, and also lays down, the public goods that are needed for the world to work. And you have basically the rest of the world that somehow is maneuvering within these set, and that has now collapsed, right? And we're now going into what I call this, multipolarity concept of powers, where you basically do no longer have a vertical structure. You no longer have principles that have been set from above. You're basically maneuvering on your own, right? So I think this kind of thinking within balance of power is one thing. That's the realist part. The transformative part is actually influenced because I've been living in Asia for 20 years, right? And I'm living within transformation, and with all the noise that it makes, it's very dynamic, it's very rapid.
Yes.
Change is always happening, right? And change creates all sorts of sometimes unfortunate, circumstances. There's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of backlashes, because it's basically power struggles. So I think if we have our starting point is realism, that we think in terms of a very cold-nosed, sober analysis of the balance of power, but that should not be the end point. And I think classical realism is sometimes a little bit limited in its imagination. It's very status quo oriented in that sense. And I think that's not enough, because the world is changing around us. Climate change is one of the things, pandemics is another thing, war at the horizon. So there's a lot of things where we cannot just be status quo oriented because the system's not working. So actually what we need, we also have to rewrite the rules of the system in order to adapt it to the circumstances. And that is the transformative part, right? It's realism in the overall epistemology, the outlook, but it actually has the goal to rearrange, social engineer and rearrange on the international arena the balance of power by building alliances in order to get something done together.
Yeah. No, I agree with that, because one of the things that we collectively, struggle from is that whatever lenses that we had so far to look at the world, whether it was classical realism or neoliberalism or whatever it was, I think it was not able to grapple with the complexity of the different variables, and also the a very dynamic virtue of those variables that coexist at the same time. And I think I completely am with you on the part that we need a new heuristics first in order to get to something more coherent and cogent. Christoph, if I may just pick your brains before I conclude the discussion, which is that, so does that mean that, for Europe on the whole, and especially for Germany, sustainability is going to take a backseat? The sustainability agenda is going to take a backseat for now?
I'm not sure. I don't buy it. I think backseat is a bit overdoing. It will be a priority. It has to be, and it lies at the core of our political conversations. Will it be deprioritized against the bigger, largest, immediate security conversation we just had? Yes, maybe.
Okay.
Sure.
So that's right. And now, just before I end it, there's a segment where I ask all these experts to tell the audience what to read, what to watch, and who to listen to. Marc, apart from Marc himself, of course. Yes.
It's too kind. What we bring together is actually a very, very interesting group of people. You're part of it, which we call the Asia Strategic Foresight Group. And there's a lot of very interesting thought leaders from pretty much all of the Asian countries, including also some Europeans and North Americans. And they also write and do video blogs, just as yourself. That all comes together on our website, which is fesasia.com. There's a lot of interesting material. There's maps, geopolitical maps that you can look at that are interactive. So a lot of the material is being assembled there, and I think that would be quite nice to have a look at.
Christoph, would you like to recommend who to read, who to watch?
I'm not going to go into full ad mode and put out some names, but I like to read India's World. That just, is very new from Raja Mohan and Happy Mon Jacob, that are friends from FES also. I like to read and dive into that lately. Also, just go to any podcast platform, type in India. There's so many very interesting formats lately, and that's basically what I do. When I don't want to read, I just listen to various thinkers about India. And as somebody that just moved to India 2 years ago, that's still a valid, great resource that I'm accessing lately.
Well, on that note, I have to agree and allude to the fact that we are living in interesting times, and we see a lot of conversations being enabled that didn't really exist before. So on that note, I think I would allude to the fact that we are living in interesting times, and the conversations that we are having now perhaps couldn't be done a few years ago. So we are living in times that have enabled these very, very meaningful conversations. And on that note, let me thank you once again, Marc Saxer, coming all the way from Bangkok, and Christoph Mohr from here in New Delhi, for a very engaging discussion for the Print Worldview with Swasti.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for having us.